right, hey, here we go. We're back with another lecture about resources, and this time we're really focusing on conservation. So if we think about the resources our planet gives us, it really is three categories. There's water resource, air as a resource, and our land. Okay, and we're going to talk about ways that we use and misuse all three of these resources. The first one we're going to focus on is water. Okay, and really when we talk about misuse of water as a resource, it's about pollution. And there's two different categories of water pollution. It's point source pollution and non-point source pollution. And a point source pollution is kind of what it sounds like. You can take your finger and you can point right at where that pollution is coming from. It's very specific, very finite in its location. You can point right to it and see the pollution entering the water. A non-point source pollution is a little more vague in its location. And it's usually just a larger area. So instead of being one pipe that's feeding pollution into a body of water, maybe it's several farm fields, like a big land area, that all get some pesticides, some chemical fertilizers, things like that, that can run off to a small river, let's say, and then the concentration could increase and that river could be polluted. So it's not one specific area, it's more of a larger, broad location in terms of a non-point source pollution. Moving on to misuse of our air resource. Okay, air is really important. Like if you don't know that, like this is, science class. Air is really important, but not just for breathing like we think with oxygen. It also protects us from some really nasty radiation from the sun. Ultraviolet radiation from the sun would completely obliterate everything on the surface of Earth if we didn't have the ozone layer. The ozone layer is made up of a molecule that's three oxygens together. And the way it protects us from ultraviolet radiation is that radiation comes in contact with ozone and it breaks apart that O3 as it absorbs the energy into an O2 and a single oxygen. And just given time, that single oxygen doesn't like to be by itself. It'll pair back together and make ozone once again. Problem is, people started releasing these chemicals into the atmosphere from things like even aerosol cans or refrigerators or air conditioners. And when it got into the stratosphere where the ozone layer is, it would pair together with those single oxygens, taking them out of the equation. So what was happening is O3 would still absorb radiation and break apart into an O2 and a single oxygen. But before that single oxygen could pair back together with the O2, what we call free radicals or chlorofluorocarbons, that's in your notes, CFCs, they would rob the atmosphere of that single oxygen and take it away. So over time, the amount of ozone in the atmosphere thinned and it was reduced. And it even made something that my generation, we studied in school called the hole in the ozone layer. That was the big, important issue everybody had to learn about in elementary school, was the hole in the ozone layer. You may have never heard of that because we outlawed CFCs, free radicals, and now just over time, the ozone layer has started to patch itself back together. Another big issue with our atmosphere and our air resource is global warming. And you know more than you think you know about global warming. Okay, and global warming is tied to this idea of the greenhouse effect and greenhouse gases. Okay, the greenhouse effect by itself is what's allowing life to be here on Earth in the first place. Okay, without the greenhouse effect and some greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide or methane or even water vapor, okay, without those greenhouse gases, Earth is just a big snowball going around the sun. Nothing would live here at all. It'd be too cold. So the greenhouse effect is very good. And the way that works is that sunlight passes through our atmosphere. And these greenhouse gases, they don't block out any sort of radiation. They're, let's say, transparent, okay? They don't even notice them. The radiation from the sun makes it right to the surface of Earth. And the surface of Earth heats up. It absorbs all this radiation, and then over time it releases that radiation into the lower atmosphere. Okay, and this is really how our planet is warmed. It's warmed from the surface outward, not from the top down. What greenhouse gases do is they trap some of that radiated surface heat back down towards Earth. It traps it, it reflects it, it keeps it near the surface of Earth so it can't escape into space. And that's what makes our planet so nice and warm for us to live here, is the greenhouse effect. Where this becomes an issue is the human-produced CO2 from things like fossil fuel burning power plants or the tailpipe of your car, combustion engines. Those are releasing excessive greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide. And what's happening is our atmosphere is getting much more thick with greenhouse gases, trapping too much heat near the surface. So the surface temperature is increasing at a rate that it's never increased in geologic time, geologic history. And that's the problem, the human-produced CO2. Moving to our land resource, there's several ways that people use, or really they can misuse, land resource. One way is just through mining. Okay? There's 500,000 mines in the US alone, and a lot of these mines are surface mines, where we just remove everything from the surface of the earth and we make these big holes in the ground. We just blast and drag and crush away the surface to expose what's underneath, really damaging our land resource. Another misuse of our land resource is farming, okay? And hear me out, farming is good. Like, I don't eat vegetables, but I know some people do. So farming is definitely good. We need farming, but it can just be done in a very devastating way to the soil, where it's just over farming. And when you farm land too often, too much, it ends up drawing out all of the nutrients and it turns the soil a lot more salty. And if you know anything about plants, most of them can't really grow in salt water. Another misuse of our land resource is clear cutting. And this is cutting down every single tree in the forest. All right, and it's really devastating to the forest because they chop down every tree. Sometimes they have to replant trees, but what happens is they only plant one type of tree, maybe just a maple tree. And that really decreases the diversity of the forest. And healthy ecosystems have a wide variety of diversity. So when they clear cut and chop every tree down, they're ruining that forest, and what they're replanting is an unhealthy forest to start. The last use or misuse of our land resource is just disposal. I'm talking about our trash, landfills. A lot of times we just put it in the bin and we roll it out to the street and then we don't think about it. And if we could go on one field trip, I would bring you all to a landfill. Because when you see these giant bulldozers and excavators just pushing around our trash, and then what we do is we eventually bury it in dirt, I think you would think again, just think twice about what you throw into the trash. Those resources, sometimes they're mineral-based resources or even the nutrients of the food we throw away, will be trapped in that landfill almost indefinitely. And there will be a time in human history where people go around and actually mine landfills for the mineral resources that are there. Okay, I'm talking about copper and gold and metal like steel and iron. Those resources are trapped in landfills. Also, nutrients from decomposing food. If we take all the food that we don't eat and we throw it in the trash, it goes in the landfill. That is nutrients that no longer will be on the fields where we're currently growing food. And those things are not issues now, they're not even on the forefront of people's mind, but in the future, those could become issues. All right, so next we've talked about the misuse of our land resource. So what do we do to protect it? One thing is just simple conservation. So not using resources as rapidly. And I like to think of my gummy bears, okay? I love some like sugar-covered gummy bears, you probably do too. And I know if I conserve my gummy bears, if I only have one or two at a time instead of 2 handfuls, those gummy bears are gonna last a longer period of time, maybe a whole week, or let's be honest, maybe a whole day, but it'll last a longer period of time. We can do that same type of thing with our resources, our non-renewable resources, like fossil fuels. If we conserve them, if we use them a little more sparingly, they're gonna last a longer period of time. Another thing we can do is pollution prevention. So this is really self-explanatory, not allowing pollution to enter the environment in the first place. So really focusing on point source and non-point source pollutions there. In terms of protecting our resources, there's actually been some laws that have been passed that do just that. They protect resources like our air, like our water. One of those laws was the Clean Water Act in 1972, and this one is just amazing. Back in 1972, only 1 out of every 3 bodies of water was safe to fish in or swim in. Okay, 1 out of every 3. And if you think about Michigan, there are ponds and just bodies of water, rivers everywhere. Only 1 out of every 3 would have been safe to touch the water or to eat the fish from that water. That's just crazy. From there until a few decades later, it went from 1/3 to 2/3 of every surface water being safe. And now in 2022 or whatever year it is, it's almost every body of water is now safe to swim in and fish in. And that's because of reducing point source pollution, non-point source pollution, the Clean Water Act. Very similar, the Clean Air Act was actually passed before the Clean Water Act, and it really limits the amount of pollution cars and industry like power plants can put into the atmosphere. And there's a list of very specific materials that they are checking for with the Clean Air Act. And 2 of them that are in bold in your notes, those 2 lead to acid precipitation. So they do a very good job at limiting sulfur oxides, nitrogen oxides, because that's what leads to acid rain. Lastly, what can we do to conserve our land resource? There's several things that we can do, and the first one is soil conservation. So instead of just farming a whole lot and farming too much and making the soil really salty, what we could do is crop rotation. So one year we're growing corn. Okay, corn grows all over Hudsonville all the time. And then the following year, maybe you've noticed this, instead of corn being in that field, what they grow is soybeans. Because soybeans, they have this bacteria that live in the roots that do this thing called nitrogen fixation. So they take nitrogen from the atmosphere and they put it into the soil as a natural fertilizer. And that's really going to preserve the nutrients and how long you can farm in that soil. Another thing, instead of clear cutting, we could do selective cutting in forest. So we're not chopping down every single tree, we're marking specific trees to log and use as lumber, as a resource. This would keep the diversity of the forest, and it won't completely eliminate the forest altogether. Another thing we could do to help our land resource is using compost or more natural fertilizers instead of chemical fertilizers. Okay, compost is just simply organic material that decomposes, and when it decomposes, it returns nutrients to the soil. My Grandpa Z, he always had a great garden, and one thing he had in his house was this small little bucket by the sink. He'd throw in apple cores and banana peels and those types of kind of like table scraps, and he'd bring it out to his garden and sprinkle it on top of his garden, because he knew, Grandpa Z is a smart guy, he knew that apple core, that banana peel, would decompose and return nutrients to the soil. All right, that's all we have about conservation. Please make sure you're filling in your notes and you're always asking questions when they come up. Thanks.